Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents. Well, today I'm not going to be talking about an American president specifically. I'm going to be talking about an era before our independence. I'm going to be talking about the population of the state of Maryland through the Felons Act of 1717, also called the Transportation Act of 1717, sometimes 1718, because the assent by the king didn't come until 1718. Sometimes it's called the Piracy Act of 1717. Basically, this was for the transportation of felons and people who had been convicted of serious crimes, felonies, also through attainders, right? Bills of attainders in England. A bill of attainder is when one is convicted without going through a trial process. For instance, it could be an act of Congress, an act of Parliament, not Congress in our case, but an act of Parliament by, by the government of Britain, and they can just convict one without of a serious offense like treason uh, without a trial. So that's a bill of attainder, and it's in our constitution. I think Article One that there no bill of, we can have no bill of attainders, right? That's illegal. We can't have a bill of attainder in America. So of course, in the 18th century, in England, in Great Britain, they were having issues concerning the crown. Of course, in the 17th century, they had convicted a king, and of course, there were the constant squabbling, fighting, in fact, civil wars regarding religion. And one of the ways that Maryland became established was because um, the Protestants who had prevailed through the Puritans in Parliament and the Civil War in England were bent on kicking out the Catholics, right? And of course, they couldn't kill all of them, so they decided to create Maryland as a proprietary colony where persecuted Catholics could be transported. They could go and receive respite. They could settle and just leave England, right? So that's the reason why Maryland was created as a proprietary colony with land grants given to a guy called Cecil Calvert, who was actually Lord Baltimore. He was the second Lord Baltimore. Um, Later on, however, of course, England continued to have their upheavals regarding religion. There was the Jacobite rising in 1745 because there were instances when they deposed their kings. When they deposed James II, James II had Catholic sympathies. He christened his son James, an infant, as a Catholic, and of course they had the glorious revolution in 1688, in which the Protestant William of Orange, his son-in-law and nephew, and his daughter Mary, who was married to William of Orange, uh, they basically overthrew King James II, whom Parliament declared had abdicated his throne when he fled to France. So there are those people who were supporting James II, and they were the Jacobites, right? They were the Jacobites who wanted James II to come back and regain the throne of England. So that was a Jacobite rising. So that was a way. So if you rebelled against the crown, it was a way for you to be attainted, and your titles, your hereditary titles, were all declared, were all seized, and so you could receive capital punishment. That's death, a death sentence, death penalty. But at that time, England was overcrowded. London was overcrowded because that was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and so the cities were becoming overcrowded, and they were having problems with the growth of urbanization, overcrowding, and so then they used to have these public executions, but they risked having riots and more rebellions, with the death penalties, with the public executions. So one way um, the death sentence, death penalty could be commuted was by being transported to America, one of England's colonies. And so they transported attainted people and other low-level criminals as well, people who, you know, who were convicted for fencing. Fencing is you're selling of stolen goods, even petty thefts. Um, Kids who were poor. So they were just carted off and sent as convicts to go and work for 7 to 14 years in the colonies. So their primary area of destination was Virginia and Maryland. So mainly in Maryland, though. So about 120,000 convicted criminals, had actually been transported to the American colonies from England before the time of the Revolution. That's to the Maryland area, Maryland and Virginia, mainly Maryland. In fact, by the time of the American Revolution in 1776, about a quarter of the population was made up of convicted criminals. So when they were transported, they worked as indentured servants. That means they worked without pay. So basically, they were slaves. But the difference between uh, indentured white servants and slaves, African slaves, was that African slaves, they were born that way. They continued perpetually in slavery. So they couldn't get out of it. They continued. Their children were slaves. They were the property of the slave owner. But the indentured servants, they were people who had committed crimes in England. They were convicted, and they gave them a time period to work it off. To work off their penalty. Of course, they weren't paid for it, and by the completion, once they completed their time, the sentence out, if it was 14 years, once they completed the 14 years, they were pardoned for the crime, and they lived on in the colony as a free person. Now, if they tried to return to England before that time, then they could be killed. They'd get this death penalty. So like being transported to the colonies to Maryland was sort of a commutation. It was like a lighter sentence. So it's kind of bizarre, what the crown, the government of England was doing, of Great Britain was doing in the 18th and 17th century, that they could just kick people, British subjects, kick them out of England and just send them off to a far off remote colony that they'd never been to before. Of course, France was doing it as well. France started the officially chartered Louisiana, which was owned by France, as a penal colony in 1719. And so they sent convicted criminals, the poor, undesirables in France, and from Paris, they sent them off there. Interestingly, something that France did was also they sent, prostitutes they picked up from uh, Paris. They sent them to marry the convicted criminals so they could start families because they wanted to settle the colonies, right? They wanted also to be able to, for them to be able to work the land so that it could provide, agricultural products like tobacco, cotton, which they could sell to the mother nation, the mother country. And the same thing with England, right? Um, while of course, there were Catholics who were sent to the state of Maryland because it was a proprietary colony for Catholics, persecuted Catholics. But again, a significant portion of the people who populated Maryland in the 18th century were convicted criminals, convicted through and transported to Maryland and Virginia to be indentured servants through the Felons Act of 1717. It's also called the Transportation Act of 1717. So it's kind of interesting. Now, apart from apart from uh, the the about a quarter of the population being indentured servants, being you know who were made indentured servants by reason of having been convicted criminals in England, in Great Britain. Um, they of course needed women, right? So the crown also wanted them to be able to start, a new life in the colonies and not return to England because again, there was overcrowding in England, and England had the attitude that they didn't want undesirable. They considered some people as being undesirable. So um, they wanted them to settle in the colonies permanently and be able to establish themselves as artisans or farmers, right? So to be able to grow agricultural products, cotton or tobacco, which they could then trade with the mother country. Of course, England was going through its period of industrialization, which industrialization means the development of mechanization, factories, and advanced technology that help them produce goods at an exponential rate. And of course, this uh, stimulated a large boom in the urban population. People were now moving from the rural areas into the urban areas, London, the towns, Birmingham. But it was also causing social, crime. It was increasing crime rates and things like that. So that was the reason why England was then kicking people out into the colonies, particularly the American colonies again, and the Chesapeake area was their destination. So England contracted with merchants. One of them, a prominent one, was a guy called Jonathan Ford, right? And so they would contract that, okay, these were bonded, a surety bond, right? Huh. I'll talk about this later on. Like when I went to work at a bank, I remember, if you work at a bank, financial services, companies, you're bonded, you're surety bond. So this is how the convicted criminals who were transported uh, through the merchants to the colonies. Uh, that's you know that was a condition of their transportation. They were bonded. They had a surety bond on them, so they were going to work as indentured servants for free, though, right, to serve out their penalty. So while Maryland and Virginia, they were not formally established as penal colonies like Georgia. Georgia was a penal colony, but for people who ostensibly were coming from debtor's prison, right? People who, because back then in England, in Europe, you could go to jail for being bankrupt, for owing money and not being able to pay. You'd go to debtor's jail. Again, Charles Dickens, a famous author, wrote about this. His father had actually gone to debtor's prison as well. And an example of people who were, convicted of this, who were transported to the Americas through the Felons Act, uh, you know, was it's instantiated in a book by Charles Dickens, Hard Times. There was a person who came from a middle class family, solidly middle class, educated family, but he committed a crime of robbery, and so um, he was made to move to America. Right, he moved to America. So that was sort of what happened back then. And again, people could even be transported for petty offenses. Now, something I was going to say though was interestingly, I was doing research on the state of Maryland, and I found that Maryland was the first state in the American colonies that passed the notorious anti-miscegenation laws. Anti-miscegenation, that means when you prohibit races from intermarrying, right? Like black people can't marry white people, right? So anti-miscegenation was a law in America from 1664 when the first anti-miscegenation laws were passed in Maryland uh, up until 1967 in the case of Love, when the case of Loving versus Virginia outlawed it. A white man who married a black woman, and they went all the way to the Supreme Court. By the time it was decided, they had broken up, but the Supreme Court, ruled it unconstitutional, that anti-miscegenation laws were unconstitutional. And so um, Loving v. Virginia, that's a 1967 case which outlawed anti-miscegenation laws. But what I found interesting is that the first anti-miscegenation law in Maryland actually only prohibited black men from marrying English women, right? So I realized that, well, it must have been to provide opportunities for the convicted white males, right, who didn't come with women, to be able to marry, to have white women available to them to marry. Interestingly, black women were not prohibited from marrying white men. So I guess the white slave masters, white men, were, I guess that's, they were able to exploit the black slave women, African slave women, more easily. But black men were prohibited, were banned from marrying English women. That's how it's expressed in the law in 1664. That was in 1664. The punishment for doing that, for black men marrying white women, English women was, or white women, was enslavement. Well, the black men were already enslaved, so I guess the threat was on the white woman that she would be enslaved. I wonder if there were enslaved white women in the colonies back then, before in the antebellum. I mean, not antebellum, before the War of Independence. So yeah, that was just something I was researching. I wanted to find out the history of Maryland, where I've been wrongfully charged, falsely charged with crimes I never committed. Um, I've talked about how I was swatted in my home, and uh, about 40 cops raided me and shot me, tased me, shot me in the head, tased me multiple times, tear gassed my apartment, and removed me naked. And then they subsequently stole my property. What's ironic is that the police officers who assaulted me, the guy who shot me, then claimed that I assaulted him, and I haven't had a trial. And it's been 3 years. I was prevented from working. They've defamed me, and of course, I've been waiting for my day in court. Of course, they're false charges, so based on prosecutorial misconduct, police misconduct, because they planted false evidence. They filed a false incident report. And of course, there's been judicial misconduct due to the corruption of Judge James Bonifant, who's been using false incompetency to stand trial orders, to delay and try to frustrate me in the process, abusing the process. So, in any event, I was offered another plea. I mean, this was from an agency in the state of Maryland concerning this case, was telling me that, well, if I go back to Nigeria and I don't come back, they will dismiss the false charges, right? Charges that should never have been filed in the first place. They will dismiss them, right? So you see, that's what you call activism, right? Activism, that's a reversion to a primitive or something that happened that was bad in the past. That's what you call activism. And that's Maryland reverting to an old primitive action, right? Trend that it was engaged in. So it just seems like back then, when people committed crimes or people were just issued bill of attainders, right? They were just convicted without a trial. So that's what the state of Maryland is trying to do. I haven't had a trial. It's just an accusation, and it's a false accusation, and I'm eager to prove it in a court of law. They fabricated a crime I never convicted. I never committed. I'm an innocent man. The state of Maryland committed a crime against me. Police officers committed a crime against me. I know why they did it, in order to obstruct justice, because I reported fraud of my boss in the Department of Defense and Department of the Navy, where they were committing fraud. And I found it, I gathered evidence, I reported it. So they framed me using through an interagency setup with with rogue agents, the rogue criminal justice system in the state of Maryland, and they framed me to obstruct justice. And I've been waiting for this day, my day in court. I'm lucky I'm alive. I thank God because it was like attempted murder. The way they tased me, they were trying to kill me, and one of the officers admitted, his name is Jeffrey Ray, police officer Jeffrey Ray. He used racial epithets on me, and he did admit that he had the intent of killing me. So, of course, I refused it because it's also bizarre because I am an American citizen. The state of Maryland has no jurisdiction over. Um, they have no jurisdiction over immigration. And besides, I'm an American citizen. One of the other things that the police officers did, and I guess with rogue agents of the Department of the Navy and Department of Defense, is they stole my certificate of naturalization, which is actually a felony offense. Right? Reported it to the FBI. They stole my certificate of naturalization, but the Montgomery County police officers denied stealing this. They also stole my cash, my other items of property, but you know, uh, I'm still waiting for justice, and I'm patient. So it's kind of funny that this was something that England used to do in the medieval ages, in at least in the 18th century, and they would use bill of attaiндers and convict people without a trial, English subjects, and just send them to America. And the major destination where they sent them was the state of Maryland. And of course, there were other convicted criminals who came and were transported forcefully, and they were not allowed to return to England, and they uh, populated the state of Maryland. Um, that was just what I wanted to discuss. I thought it was kind of interesting. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents. Today, I was just talking about the history of the state of Maryland, the not so flattering history. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.